You didn't suddenly become selfish. You became aware of how often your yes came with a tightening in your chest, aware of how often you agreed, while quietly disappearing, aware of how much effort it took to keep everyone comfortable while you felt depleted. This is where guilt begins, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you were trained to measure your goodness by how little you needed. You were rewarded for being flexible, understanding, low maintenance. You learned early that love stayed when you didn't ask for much. So when you finally choose yourself, your body doesn't feel proud at first. It feels exposed because choosing yourself interrupts a survival pattern, not a personality trait. For a long time, your nervous system associated safety with anticipation, with noticing shifts in tone, with adjusting before conflict, with giving before being asked. That's why self-choice didn't feel empowering at first. It felt dangerous. Your system wasn't asking, "Is this right?" It was asking, "Will I still belong if I stop?" This is the part no one tells you. Guilt doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're unfamiliar with being centered in your own life. You weren't choosing yourself before because you didn't want to. You weren't choosing yourself because you didn't feel permitted to. And now, when you say no without explanation, when you don't overclarify, when you don't soften the edge of your boundary, your body reacts, not with confidence, with fear, a quiet fear that says, something bad will happen now. That fear isn't intuition. It's conditioning. It's the echo of moments where your needs were inconvenient, where your emotions were too much, where your presence was welcomed, only if it came without friction. So choosing yourself doesn't feel clean. It feels shaky. You replay the moment afterward. You wonder if you were harsh, if you could have said it nicer, if you asked for too much. But notice this. You're not questioning your values. You're questioning your right to have them. That's the shift. Self-choice with guilt is still self-choice. And guilt doesn't mean regression. It means your nervous system is recalibrating. You are teaching it. That connection doesn't require collapse. That closeness doesn't demand self-erasure. That love doesn't need you smaller. And slowly, something begins to change. The guilt shortens. The recovery time after saying no gets faster. Your body starts to notice that nothing terrible happens when you stay aligned. Some people leave. Some dynamics change. Some access is removed. But what remains is quieter, cleaner. You stop performing care. You start embodying it. And choosing yourself stops feeling like a betrayal and starts feeling like relief. Not dramatic relief, subtle relief. The kind that lets your shoulders drop. The kind that lets your breath deepen. The kind that doesn't need approval to feel real. This is what it feels like before confidence arrives. Not bold, not loud, not empowered in the way it's marketed, but regulated. And regulation is the foundation of every woman who no longer abandons herself. You start noticing it in moments that used to pass unnoticed. The pause before you answer a request, the way your body waits to see if you'll override it again. Because for a long time, you didn't need someone to pressure you. You did it yourself. You anticipated disappointment before it ever arrived. You adjusted in advance. You minimized instinctively. That's why choosing yourself now doesn't just change your behavior. It destabilizes an entire internal system that learns safety through compliance. Your nervous system was shaped around staying connected, not staying truthful. Connection came first. Self came second. So when you choose yourself, your system doesn't register it as growth. It registers it as risk. This is where guilt lives, not in morality, in attachment. Because attachment taught you that being loved meant being needed, and being needed meant being available. Emotionally, energetically, mentally, you learned to stay open, even when you were tired, to stay soft, even when something felt off, to stay generous, even when it cost you clarity. So now, when you don't overextend, your body searches for the familiar discomfort. It waits for the backlash, the withdrawal, the shift in tone. And when it doesn't come immediately, the guilt fills the silence. You mistake it for conscience, but it's memory, memory of what used to happen when you took up space. This is why reassurance doesn't help, because the conflict isn't cognitive, it's somatic. Your body is learning a new rule that safety can exist without self sacrifice, that love can coexist with limits, that closeness doesn't require vigilance. This is not something you think your way through, it's something you experience again and again until your system believes it. Each time you don't explain yourself and survive the moment, each time you choose rest and the world doesn't collapse, each time you say no and the connection doesn't disappear. This is how guilt loosens, not through affirmations, through repetition. And there's another layer here most people miss. When you choose yourself without guilt, you also stop managing other people's reactions. You stop bracing for disappointment that isn't yours to hold. You stop absorbing emotions that were never meant to be carried by you. This can feel cold at first, detached, unfamiliar, because empathy was once your currency. You learned to sense what others needed before they spoke it. You were praised for being intuitive, for being understanding, for being emotionally available. But what was never acknowledged was the cost of always orienting outward, the cost of losing access to your own internal signals. So now, when you stay with yourself, it feels like neglect, not because it is, but because you were taught that attunement only counted when it was directed at others. Choosing yourself without guilt means relearning where attunement belongs, not instead of connection, but before it. You don't become less caring. You become more accurate. You stop offering care where it isn't received, where it isn't respected, where it requires self-erasure. And this is where something subtle shifts. You realize you're not calmer because you care less. You're calmer because you're no longer divided. There's no internal negotiation happening, no quiet override, no self-abandonment disguised as kindness. Your body starts trusting you again. It stops sending urgency signals, stops tightening before conversations, stops rehearsing outcomes, because it knows now that you won't leave it behind. This is what choosing yourself is really teaching your system, not independence, reliability. You become the one person you don't have to convince. And that's when guilt starts to feel out of place, like a reflex from a life you no longer live. Not something to fight, just something to notice and let pass. Something changes quietly when choosing yourself stops being a decision and starts being a baseline. Your relationships feel it before you name it, not because you announce boundaries, not because you explain less, but because your energy is no longer split. You show up whole, and that changes the dynamic in ways you didn't expect. Some people soften, they meet you differently, they adjust without being asked. Others don't. And this is where clarity begins. Because when you're no longer negotiating your own needs internally, you stop compensating externally. You don't fill silence. You don't smooth tension. You don't rescue conversations from discomfort. You let moments land. And that can feel unsettling to people who relied on your emotional labor to regulate themselves. They may say you've changed, not as an observation, as a complaint. What they're really noticing is the absence of your overfunctioning. You're no longer anticipating what they need before they feel it. You're no longer translating their emotions for them. You're no longer staying one step ahead to keep the connection smooth. And without that buffer, their experience becomes clearer. So does yours. You start noticing who leans in when you pause, who respects your no without punishment, who can sit with you without being entertained, reassured, or emotionally managed. This isn't about standards, it's about capacity. Some people simply don't know how to relate without intensity, without urgency, without your constant availability. And when you're no longer supplying that, the relationship reveals its true shape. This is not rejection, it's information. You also begin to feel how different connection is when it doesn't cost you. There's more space in conversations, more room to breathe, less pressure to perform closeness. You're not trying to be understood, you're allowing yourself to be seen. And if someone misunderstands you, you don't chase clarity, you observe, because you trust now that being misread is less painful than being misaligned. This is a major shift. Before, misunderstanding felt dangerous, like abandonment waiting to happen. So you explained, you clarified, you adjusted your tone, you softened your truth. Now, misunderstanding feels neutral, not ideal, but not threatening, because your sense of safety is no longer outsourced. It lives with you. This is why choosing yourself changes the kind of intimacy you tolerate. You no longer bond through fixing, through proving, through emotional endurance. You bond through presence, through mutual regulation, through respect that doesn't need reminders. And when that's missing, you don't spiral, you don't personalize it. You feel the disappointment without collapsing into it. That's emotional maturity, embodied, not detachment, not indifference, discernment. You also notice something else. You're less reactive, not because you suppress feelings, but because fewer things actually violate you. Your boundaries aren't rigid, they're lived. So when something crosses them, your body responds clearly, not with confusion, not with self-doubt, with knowing. This makes conflict different too. You don't enter it to be understood at all costs. You enter it to stay aligned with yourself. And if alignment costs the connection, you don't panic. You grieve cleanly, without bargaining. This is one of the hardest parts of choosing yourself without guilt. Accepting that some relationships were sustained by your self-abandonment, and that when you stop doing that, they don't survive, not because you failed, but because they were never built to hold the whole of you. There's grief here, real grief, not dramatic, quiet, the grief of realizing how much you gave to keep things afloat and how little was required when you finally stopped. But alongside the grief, there's relief, deep relief, because you're no longer guessing. You're no longer wondering if you're asking too much. You're no longer negotiating with your own exhaustion. Your life feels simpler, not easier, cleaner. And that cleanliness creates space for relationships that don't need you to disappear to function, for connections that feel calm without being flat, for love that doesn't confuse intensity with intimacy. This is what Section 3 is really about. Not loss, realignment. You're not becoming harder to love. You're becoming harder to misuse. By the time you reach this place, something important has already happened. You've stopped waiting for permission to be at peace. You're no longer asking yourself if it's okay to feel the way you feel. You trust the signal before the story. That's the shift. Choosing yourself without guilt doesn't mean you never feel doubt again. It means doubt no longer gets the final say. You notice it. You don't obey it. You let it pass through a body that finally knows. It will not be abandoned because that's what changed. Not your strength, not your independence, your loyalty. You stopped being loyal to versions of yourself that survived by shrinking. You stopped defending dynamics that required your silence. You stopped translating your needs into something more convenient for others to digest. And in doing so, you became quieter inside, not numb, settled. The nervous system doesn't crave drama when it feels safe. It doesn't chase intensity when it's no longer starving. So now, your choices come from a different place. You don't choose people who feel familiar. You choose people who feel steady. You don't stay because leaving feels cruel. You leave because staying feels dishonest. You don't explain your growth. You live it. And that does something subtle, but profound. It reorganizes your identity. You're no longer the woman who needs to be understood to feel okay. You're the woman who understands herself and moves accordingly. This is why guilt fades, not because you fought it, but because it no longer makes sense. In a life where you are aligned, guilt was a response to self-betrayal. When the betrayal ends, so does the guilt. What replaces it is something calmer. Integrity. You feel it when you say no and sleep well, when you choose rest without justification, when you walk away without needing closure. That costs you your dignity. Integrity doesn't shout, it steadies. And from that steadiness, your life begins to reflect you, not the version of you that coped, the version of you that chose herself and stayed. If this resonated, let it land. You don't need to do anything with it. Just notice how your body feels when you imagine never abandoning yourself again. That knowing is enough.